On this channel, we don't really care how good a game was 30 years ago. We care if it's worth playing now. So we're giving every game on the Mega Drive Mini 15 minutes, whether I've played it before or not, to see if you should be playing it when you get your machine. This is the fourth and final part. If you've not seen the others, a helpful link is hovering somewhere in the top right of your screen about now. If you only care about games from Street Fighter onwards in the alphabet, then I have some very good news. Street Fighter 2 Special Championship Edition. An introduction probably isn't needed here. We all know Street Fighter 2. This was Sega's response to the SNES version selling approximately 11 billion Super Nintendos. It has two major tricks the SNES and original arcade version can't do. You get to play as the four bosses, Vega, Bullrog, Sagat and M. Bison. You can do mirror mode matches where both players can be the same character. And the special part of the title indicates the option of the faster speed modes and balancing changes from the third arcade version, Hyper Fighting. For users in the UK, this is the one time you'll rue that Sega cheapened out and gave us 3 rather than 6 button pads with the Mini. A few games we've covered support it, most notably Comic Zone for easier item selection, but this is the only game that was designed for 6 buttons. If you play it with 3, you're stuck with a workaround where the start button switches between punches and kicks. If you have one of Retrobit's lovely 6 button pads, that'll work with the Mini. And we'd recommend that if you can. It's what we've played every single one of these games on. And there's no point beating around the bush here. I've played a few 2D beat-em-ups for this and Yesterzine, including the pile of steaming effluent that is Rise of the Robots, Ultraman, Super Godzilla and Eternal Champions. And you'd be forgiven for wondering if it was just that beat-em-ups used to be slow, unresponsive, exploit-filled hellholes. They're not. This has barely aged, and I strongly suspect could end as many relationships in two-player now as it could a quarter of a century ago. I'll let you know when I get hold of the machine, because the first argument is going to occur when I reveal I only have one 6-button controller. I don't know about Arcade Perfect, but having had a brief go on a Street Fighter arcade machine recently, this is damned close. The animation in the background of the stages appears all present, and it moves like last orders have just been called. Quite apart from the base game, this has a huge number of modes, including difficulty settings, group battles, and the ability to turn the time limits off. The only thing I noticed, which could be my emulation, were a couple of bits of slowdown around things like start and end of stages, causing a little sound breakup. I suspect though that's just how it was styled, because I quit my arcade run early to make sure I tried the then Mega Drive exclusive Hyper Fighting mode on full speed, and yeah, it runs. Either buy 0 or 2 of the 6-button controllers and invite your mates around, because this is the party game it always was, and that's how it should be played. Streets of Rage 2. Now this is the most famous entry in Sega's most famous runny punchy kicky game series. But this not generally being my genre, I didn't really have any preconceived notions going in to play it for 15 minutes from this, other than hoping it was more Golden Axe than Altered Beast. The intro. Watch the intro. Or rather, listen to the intro. This is another Yuzo Koshiro scored game, and it's fairly incredible. Look, I'll just shut up for 10 seconds. A Mega Drive probably should not be able to do that, and it continues in the game where my character seems to be rather syncing up to it. Can't blame her really, but we've got a city to save, or a boyfriend to rescue, or possibly just a bar bill to run away from. I forgot to actually read the story. Streets though is immediately top tier punch 'em up. It helps that we don't see many of these games, but if anything I like this more than Golden Axe. The setting appears more than the fantasy setting of that game, and while we lose the excellent magic, we gain the tactics of special abilities that cost health. And both stealable and discoverable weapons to use. This is probably nearly as famous as Sonic, so not one I need to go on about for too long. I don't remember what it was like in 1993, but this does not appear to have aged. It's superb fun, and a game I am complete and total bobbins at. Thankfully, the appearance on the Mini means that's something I can go and fix. Or just get a better player to do co-op with me. You'll have to forgive me though, because I've just found out M2 did a 3D version for the Nintendo 3DS, so I've got a game to buy. Strider. Strider is perhaps a less known game from the run and swipe school, and one that hasn't really had any remakes or compilation appearances. Its gimmick is that of free movement. Ian Strider leaps about the place, making use of platforms, vertical surfaces and anything else that comes to hand. Which is good, because this is an enemy-heavy game, and one I found really difficult to get my head around at first. It can certainly be unfair, with at least one occasion of dying because I fell down a hole the wrong way into an unseen enemy. There's also this closing door on stage 2, where I fully accept it could be me being stupid, but as far as I can tell, if you don't slide under it first time, then you have no option except suicide to continue. There's also a strange lack of sound. Big explosions are completely silent, the music repetitive, and the SFX Spartan. I did though get further with each game. My 15 minutes comfortably got me past the first stage, which it'd have to because there are also some very strict time limits. It'd probably do better with me, if not for having directly followed Streets of Rage. It's probably worth playing, but it does not sit high up on my list, on a machine with a surplus of this kind of game. Super Fantasy Zone. Like Alex Kidd, this was really an 8-bit mascot for Sega, and this was the only 16-bit outing. In America it wasn't even that. As with Wily Wars, this is the first time that Americans can buy this as a physical release. It's a horizontally scrolling shooter that's basically another punt at converting the original arcade game. And I'm glad they did. While the 8-bit conversions of Fantasy Zone were great, this is on another level. While some arcade shooters make themselves difficult using the slightly lazy bullet hell method, Fantasy Zone simply doesn't need to. It relies on smart enemies and strategies, and not a small amount of speed as you need to destroy all the enemy generators to get to the boss, while they're generating enemies, who of course are coming after you, aggressively in some cases. Enemies pay you money, bosses pay you a lot of money, and those you use to buy the essentials of combat, such as laser beams, extra ships, and cool racing stripes to make you extra quick. Fantasy Zone is a fairly unique beast in the shooter genre, and on a machine that doesn't really have many shooters like this Mini, it's a must-play. Thunder Force 3. Well, thank you, gods of alphabetical ordering. Not 7 seconds after I said there weren't many shooters, up steps Thunder Force 3 with its scrolling and its bullets and its being a sodding shooting game. Git. Quick history lesson since I had to double check. Late last episode I mentioned Space Harrier 2 and Thunderblade were the 2 Mega Drive launch games in Japan. Despite incredibly unhelpfully both being shooters, they are unrelated series. Although, just to muddy the waters, Thunder Force 2 and Thunderblade were both US launch titles. Get a new name, chaps. Lightning Sword, perhaps. Or Drizzle Shovel. Or even Slightly Cloudy Bread Knife. Anyway, this is the sequel to that launch game, still an early Mega Drive game, and unusually for games of this era, one that became an arcade game after its Mega Drive release. It feels like an arcade game though, in that I'm awful at it, and it could eat 10p's like that joke I'd make if this were a Yestazine episode. It's one of those shooters that likes to be spectacular. 30 seconds into the game, it's thrown 2 helper ships and some homing missiles at you. And you need them, because 1 minute into my first game, I was very dead. There's moments of unfairness, not least that the enemies appear from nowhere with very little warning. It might be a trope of the genre, but it's why the genre has aged. Games, especially arcade games, should generally rely on skill rather than memory. It's why I need to have a very long rant about Rick Dangerous at some point. That said, and despite us having 2 in a row now, this is still an unrepresented genre on this collection. And again, they've chosen a good ambassador. You'll want to have a quick game of Thunder Force. And then 5 more quick games because they really will be quick games. Toe Jam and Earl. So for the Toe Jam fans in the audience, let me just say this, because you might enjoy it. I've not been reading the manuals for these games. I've never played Toe Jam and Earl. I had no idea what Toe Jam and Earl was. You may all laugh at me now. This was, briefly, very, very confusing. Because Toe Jam and Earl is like nothing else on the machine. Or possibly anything else in the ever. Having cracked and went to get the manual, if I had to describe it as anything, it's a hide-and-seek treasure RPG. In short, find the 10 parts to rebuild the spaceship on ever more elaborate levels where, mostly, you have no weapons and have to avoid all the enemies. To help you, you have presents, which you can find in the levels. When opened, these have good or bad effects. Once you've opened a present though, you know what it is, and the game will mark it as such in the menu. Until of course you hit the present, which is the randomizer, which randomises every present type again. Oh, and the levels are also randomly generated, which was a much larger thing in 1991 than it is today. I'm not sure if I enjoyed that 15 minutes or not. Toe Jam is no longer quite so unique, and it's undeniably slow and awkward to control with not that much to do. And yet, it's got character. The music is very unique, described online mostly as jazz-funk hip-hop, which is not a thing. It also fully embraces its era with just about every 90s stereotype crammed in. I understand it comes alive in co-op and I can see it. If you've played the LEGO games, you'll have some idea how it handles it, with the wrinkle that if both characters are nearby presents, the presents affect both of them. That's a mode I'm going to have a go at playing, and for that reason as much as anything, I'm going to give this one more of a go. Vector Man. Ah, Sega's late-era Mega Drive mascot Hope. Vector Man is some sort of robot. He's been left on Earth to help clean up the mess after the humans realise they've trashed the planet and buggered off into space. Incidentally, how sad is it that this is a 25-year-old game and we appear to have achieved nothing since? Unfortunately, one of the people handling said deployment appears to have accidentally installed a nuclear warhead in one of the robots, and it goes mad. We've all had Fridays like this. Vector Man is a run-and-gun game that embraces the late 16-bit style of rendering everything using one of those fancy room-sized computers your phone now laughs at, and then using that CGI art in the game. Think Rise of the Robots, which is about average for how it tended to turn out when it translated to gameplay. Same here really. Vector Man is a bit limited. You run, you shoot your single gun in prescribed directions to kill a small variety of other controlled robots, and you kill some bosses. Or you try to, because the one I reached in 15 minutes is really quite hard and I didn't get past him. Actually, I reached him in about 5 minutes, then of course, as bosses do, he killed me the first time, and the game put me right back to the start of the level to try again. Obviously it didn't quite take 5 minutes to get to him again, but equally obviously, if you rush through these levels, you take damage, making the boss even harder. 15 minutes is about where I'd have stopped anyway, having got incredibly bored of traipsing through a well-known level to get to the actual challenge. We're short of shooters on this machine, we are not short of run-and-gun games. By my last attempt, all I'm thinking is, I could be playing Gunstar Heroes or Contra right now, and I could, so I did, so should you. Virtua Fighter 2. This is a bit of a weird inclusion. Virtua Fighter was Sega's attempt to tackle Tekken, and the rise of the 3D fighting game in the mid-90s. It lasted for several installments, and while never hitting Tekken's heights, is generally well regarded. The Mega Drive can't do a Tekken-style fighter. The Saturn was a year old and literally had 3 versions of Virtua Fighter by this point. The Mega Drive was commercially pretty much dead by this point. And yet, Sega decided to invest quite a bit of money re-architecting Virtua Fighter 2 as a mostly 2D fighter for their aging machine, using movesets from both 2 and the first game. Then again, you think this is strange, there's actually a Master System Virtua Fighter 2. It didn't end well. Or start well. The middle I can take or leave. But to be fair, there's nothing to say a Virtua Fighter 2D couldn't be good, with the possible exception of the definition-stretching use of Virtua. Well, the game itself might have a go. It's not a super inspiring thing, and it's a little sluggish. I found it pretty tricky to pull off even basic moves such as a flying kick because the game didn't want to respond to button inputs in the air. I also think it's missing some characters. It's not worthless, it's not Eternal Champions, but it's really tricky to find a reason to keep playing this in a world where Street Fighter 2 is just down the menu from it. Maybe in 2-player it'll be a nice break, but it really feels like when they tried to get Mortal Kombat on the Master System and had to cut out a bunch of stuff. Problem is, the first 2 Mortal Kombats actually turned out to be pretty fun Master System games. This kinda doesn't. Wonder Boy in Monster World. We covered the slightly bizarre naming scheme for Monster World last episode, but suffice to say this is the 5th Wonder Boy and the 3rd Monster World, despite being the first game to have Monster World in its title. Last time we had Monster World 4, the direct sequel to this game. And again, this is a Metroid or Castlevania style light RPG where you run, hack, slash, get new abilities, retread old ground and save a princess, a kingdom, or your game, depending on the level of plot they've signed up to. We can address this one very simply though. Wonder Boy's biggest issue is Monster World 4. Because while this is a reasonably pleasant game, even with the language barrier in my copy, Monster World 4 is the better game in literally every respect. Wonder Boy's dull, repetitive enemies and locations and the infinite spawning they love to do made my 15 minutes a trudge, and I can't imagine I'll play this when there's a Monster World 4 to play. So we'll spend no more time on it. World of Illusion. And our last game is also sharing the machine with its series mate. But this time, World of Illusion is the later game. This time, Mickey and Donald are doing their magic show, and then someone traps them in a box for being insufficiently good at magic, making this the only magic show harsher than Penn and Teller Foolers. The basic concept is the same though: traverse some very disparate worlds with low speed platforming gameplay. And World is certainly as imaginative. In the 15 minutes we did jungle, rock, spiderweb, Wile E. Coyote rock plunge, and clouds. The obvious question to answer though is, which do I like better? And that's easy, it's Castle. This is supposed to be the much easier game, and that was obvious. The only challenge I encountered in 15 minutes were the jumping across the clouds, and mostly then only because they disappear on you. I suspect with more time I'll breeze through that, and I'm dreadful. World doesn't quite have the imagination or enemy variety of Castle from the first 15 minutes, and while it's still pretty damn good, you'll want to play Castle instead. At least first. So that's the 40 original games, but perhaps taking a cue from Nintendo's inclusion of the unreleased Star Fox 2 on the SNES Mini, Sega have dragged up 2 games you won't have played before in order to convince you to buy this thing. And as such, you should absolutely give both the following games a go just for history's sake. A new Mega Drive game is not a common thing these days, and you should take advantage. It does present a problem though. This channel does not yet have a Mega Drive Mini. We're not nearly important enough to be given an advance copy thanks to our position as man of the people, i.e. poor. So while maybe one of those YouTubers with more followers than meat dress Lady Gaga in a dog pound has played these, we're having to go by other versions. Darius. A 1987 Taito arcade shoot-'em-up. Unless you played it in the arcade though, this one won't be super familiar to you. There were ports to the 16-bit computers and the unreleased in the UK PC Engine, but that's about it. The Mega Drive port is a new one by M2, and is likely to fall somewhere between the Amiga and arcade versions. This is what the arcade version looks like. And while I get that this episode makes my claim of us being short of shooters less convincing than literally whatever the last thing Donald Trump said is, but a new one to the Mega Drive is still very welcome. I don't know what the Mega Drive will do with that very widescreen aspect ratio, but otherwise there's nothing here a Mega Drive shouldn't be able to do. It actually feels less technically impressive than Thunder Force, which, being as the arcade is from 1986, perhaps shouldn't surprise me. Nonetheless, it's something new for everyone when we all get the machine, which for the non-Brits has already happened by the time you view this. Tetris. I'm going to assume you know Tetris, but unless you're a very lucky person, you've never played Tetris on the Mega Drive. There was a port in Japan only, but it never made it to a commercial release. There existed less than 10 copies. It's unknown how many of those even survived. It has, at least, been dumped, and it's that version you're watching now. This, though, is not quite the version for the Mega Drive Mini. The internet appears to be a little confused on whether this is the original Mega Drive version, a warmed-over version of that, or an entirely new port. M2 themselves claim it's an entirely new arcade port, but it certainly looks very similar to the version we've seen before on a Japanese Sega Ages disc. If so, though, it's going to be Tetris ported by M2, and so very likely is going to be the third best Tetris that exists. Because even M2 won't beat the Game Boy version for sheer icon status, and virtually nothing in gaming beats the experience of playing Tetris Effect in VR. And you're going to try it though, aren't you? Because any Tetris is a good time. So that's the 42. Plenty to be getting on with. We need a winner for this episode, and while Street Fighter 2 makes a strong case, it's the Of Rage variety that's getting the nod, joining Castle of Illusion, Gunstar Heroes and Shinobi 3 as the picks. But there's a great number worth playing here. I don't, of course, have hands-on experience of the machine itself. If anything goes hideously wrong with the UK version, I'll let you know, but those people with them seem to be appreciating them. The UK gets it 1 week from this video's release date on the 4th of October. In the meantime, there's playlist links in case you missed an episode, and some more Sega-themed suggestions the other side of the credits. And I'll leave you to watch those while I go back for another punt at Streets of Rage 2. I've watched a long play, but it turns out to be that good takes ages. Till next Mini.